The alarm clock hit the wooden floorboards at exactly 5 in the morning. It did not just ring, it shuddered, a sharp, metallic buzzing that traveled through the floor and into the walls of the tiny room. The sound was relentless, a jagged rhythm cutting through the heavy, stagnant air of the apartment. Thomas lay motionless for a heartbeat, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. Then, his hand moved. It was a slow, agonizing reach. His fingers splayed against the cold, rough grain of the wood. He searched blindly, his arm trembling with the weight of deep, bone-crushing fatigue. The vibration was a physical pulse beneath his palm, mocking the stillness he craved. He shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning under the movement, and his knuckles brushed against the plastic casing of the clock. He pressed down hard, his thumb finding the button, and the buzzing stopped instantly. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavier than the noise had been. He stayed on the floor for a long moment, the wood grain pressing into his cheek. The air in the apartment was thin and sharp, biting at his skin the second he stopped moving. He pushed himself up, his joints popping with a dry, brittle sound that echoed in the small space. His head throbbed, a rhythmic pulse of pain that matched the lingering echo of the alarm. He gripped his knees, his knuckles white, and forced his spine to straighten. The cold was not just in the air. It was in the walls, in the floor, and in the very stillness of the room. He sat there, shivering, his breath hitching as he tried to steady his racing heart. The fatigue was a physical weight, pulling at his shoulders, demanding he lie back down. He ignored it. Thomas pulled his feet onto the floorboards. Each movement felt heavy, as if his limbs were filled with lead. He stood, his knees locking with a sharp protest, and navigated the narrow path to the desk. The surface was scarred by years of use, stained with dark rings of grease that caught the faint gray light filtering through the window. He sat down, the wooden chair groaning under his weight. His hands hovered over the laptop. He hesitated, his fingers hovering above the keys, before he pushed the lid open. The hinge creaked. The screen flared, a sudden, piercing burst of blue light that cut through the darkness of the room. He squinted, his eyes stinging, and blinked rapidly to clear the haze. The glare washed over his face, highlighting the deep lines of fatigue etched into his features. He reached for the mouse, his hand shaking, and guided the cursor toward the icon for the Excel tutorial. He clicked. The screen displayed a grid of empty cells, a digital void that demanded order. Thomas leaned closer, his nose inches from the glass. The tutorial video played in a small window, a voice explaining functions he had never encountered. He watched the cursor dance across the screen, highlighting cells and dragging boxes. He tried to mimic the movements, but his fingers felt clumsy, striking the wrong keys. He deleted the entry and started again. He typed an equal sign, then a string of letters that looked like a foreign language. The computer beeped, a sharp, flat sound of error. He did not flinch. He cleared the cell and began the sequence once more. His eyes darted between the tutorial and his own spreadsheet, his brow furrowed in concentration. He did not understand the logic behind the formulas, but he typed the commands with a rhythmic, mechanical persistence. His pulse slowed as he focused entirely on the screen. He entered a sum, then a range, then a filter. He typed, he corrected, he typed again, and the grid began to fill. The clock on the wall clicked to 6 a.m. Thomas pushed his chair back, the wood scraping harshly against the floor. He stood up, his joints popping in a rhythmic sequence that echoed in the small room. He looked at the laptop one last time, the screen still pulsing with rows of data, then snapped it shut. The room plunged into a dull gray stillness. He walked to the door, his movements stiff from hours of sitting, and turned the handle. The air outside hit him like a physical weight, sharp and biting. He stepped onto the sidewalk and stopped. The town was a graveyard of silence, devoid of life or movement. Thick, low-hanging mist clung to the pavement, swirling around his ankles as he began to walk. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and exhaled. A cloud of white vapor bloomed in front of his face, dissipating slowly into the damp atmosphere. He fell into a steady, measured pace, his boots striking the concrete. He walked with his head held high, his focus fixed on the path ahead. Each step was deliberate, a quiet assertion of his intent. Thomas picked up his pace, his boots striking the pavement with increasing force. The steady rhythm of his walk sharpened into a focused, aggressive stride. He turned the corner, his gaze fixed on the rising slope of the street ahead. As he climbed, his breath grew ragged, tearing through his throat in short, sharp gasps. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, insistent drumbeat that drowned out the silence of the sleeping town. He felt the burn in his thighs, a dull ache that pulsed with every step, but he did not slow down. He leaned into the incline, his arms pumping at his sides, driving his body forward against the resistance of the hill. The cold morning air stung his lungs, yet he welcomed the sharp, metallic taste of exertion. He reached the crest of the street and did not stop. He pushed into a sprint, his legs churning, his focus narrowing to the next few feet of concrete. He was no longer just walking. He was chasing a version of himself that existed beyond this exhaustion. He rounded the final corner, his chest heaving, his pulse thundering in his ears. He slowed to a halt, leaning forward with his hands on his knees, watching his own breath swirl in the mist. His heart rate remained high, a physical testament to the effort he was pouring into his own transformation. He stood upright, wiped the sweat from his brow, and turned back toward his apartment. Thomas pushed the door shut, the latch clicking into place with a hollow, final sound. He walked to the center of the room, his legs heavy, and dropped onto the edge of the mattress. He did not lie down. Instead, he reached for the worn textbook on the floor. The cover was frayed, the edges softened by constant handling. He opened it to the marked page. His eyes scanned the lines of text, but the words swam and blurred into dark, meaningless shapes. He blinked, rubbing his palms against his face to clear the fog of fatigue. His eyelids felt like lead, pulling downward with every passing second. He forced his gaze back to the page, focusing on a complex ledger entry. The numbers danced, shifting in and out of clarity as his head began to nod. He gripped the spine of the book until his knuckles turned white, using the sharp pain in his hands to anchor his focus. He read one sentence, then another, his breath hitching in his chest. The silence of the room pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating, but he did not yield. He traced the lines with his index finger, mouthing the definitions of assets and liabilities to keep his mind from drifting. His vision tunneled, the world narrowing down to the ink on the paper. He was exhausted, his body screaming for rest. Yet he turned the page. He was paying the price of his ambition, one difficult, blurred line at a time. The clock on the wall clicked to 7:30. Thomas did not look up. He read the final paragraph of the chapter, his eyes burning, his head heavy with the weight of the day's labor. He closed the textbook, the sound of the cover hitting the mattress muffled and soft. He stood up, his joints popping, and felt the sudden, sharp shift in the room's atmosphere. A sliver of pale, morning light cut across the floorboards, creeping toward his feet. The sun was rising. He watched the light move, a slow, steady crawl that signaled the end of his night. He did not feel the usual panic of a wasted morning. Instead, he felt a strange, quiet weight in his chest. He moved to the mattress and collapsed, his body sinking into the fabric as if it were water. The tension in his limbs drained away, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, the darkness behind his lids was not a void. It was a map. Days bled into weeks, the sharp edges of his exhaustion softening into a predictable rhythm. The initial agony of the 5 o'clock wake-up call began to dissolve, replaced by a cold, mechanical precision. He stopped fighting the morning. He simply surrendered to the cycle. His body learned the schedule before his mind could even register the hour. By the second month, the alarm clock on the floor became a redundant relic. It sat silent, its digital display blinking in the dark, but it never had the chance to sound. At 4:58, his eyes snapped open. There was no grogginess, no hesitation, and no struggle to pull himself from the sheets. He stared at the dark ceiling, his breath steady and shallow. He sat up in one fluid motion, his feet finding the cold floorboards without a second thought. The silence of the apartment was no longer a weight, it was a workspace. He looked at the clock, watching the numbers shift from 4:58 to 4:59. He reached down, flipped the switch to off, and stood up. The transition was complete. He was no longer a man forcing himself to endure a schedule. He was a man governed by the internal clock of his own ambition. The laptop screen flickered to life, casting a sharp, blue glow across the desk. Thomas did not hesitate. He reached into the drawer and pulled out a stack of crumpled paper, each sheet covered in scribbled notes he had kept hidden during his shifts at the warehouse. These were the fragments of a system he had observed for years, now ready to be decoded. He opened the spreadsheet, the grid of empty cells waiting like a blank map. His fingers moved across the keys with a new, quiet confidence. He began to input the numbers, one by one, watching as the raw data filled the rows. Each entry was a piece of the puzzle he had been building in the dark. He cross-referenced the delivery times, the lost inventory, and the gaps in the flow of goods. The screen became a mirror of his own focus, turning the messy reality of the warehouse floor into a structured, logical sequence. The screen grew dense with color-coded cells, a sprawling web of numbers that finally began to breathe. Thomas leaned in, his eyes tracing the jagged lines of the supply chain. He found it. A recurring bottleneck in the third-quarter shipping logs, a ghost in the system that had cost the warehouse thousands in lost revenue. He had watched this error manifest for years, a silent drain on the floor, but now he held the proof in his own hands. He began to build a dashboard, dragging columns and linking formulas until the chaos of the warehouse floor was reduced to a singular, undeniable truth. The complexity of the project grew with every click. He layered the data, creating predictive models that showed not just where the system failed, but why. His hands moved with a frantic, controlled energy, his mind racing to keep pace with the patterns emerging on the monitor. He sat back, the blue light reflecting in his eyes, and watched the final graph settle into place. The trap was set. The final cell blinked, the formula locking into place with a soft, digital snap. Thomas let go of the mouse. The dashboard was complete. It was a sprawling, intricate map of every wasted hour and every lost shipment he had witnessed. He leaned back, his chair creaking in the stillness of the apartment. He did not move for a long time. He simply watched the screen, his eyes scanning the columns one last time to ensure the math held firm. He cross-referenced the totals against the mental logs he had kept for years. The numbers were perfect. They were cold, hard, and undeniable. He reached out and clicked the save icon, the cursor hovering over the file name for a heartbeat before he finalized it. 730 hours of labor were now contained within a single small file. The weight of it settled in his chest. He looked at his reflection in the glass, then back at the glowing monitor. The chaos of the warehouse had been tamed. The trap was ready. The office door clicked shut behind him, sealing out the warehouse noise. Thomas walked to the center of the room and set his laptop on the desk. The supervisor looked up, eyes narrowing at the intrusion. Thomas did not wait for an invitation. He pulled a chair out, sat down, and opened the lid. The screen glowed, casting a sharp clinical light across the polished wood. He did not fidget. He did not look at the floor. He kept his hands flat on the desk, fingers steady, and waited for the supervisor to focus on the display. The air in the office felt thin, charged with the sudden shift in their dynamic. Thomas leaned forward, his posture rigid and alert. He reached out and tapped the trackpad, the cursor jumping to the primary dashboard. He caught the supervisor's gaze and held it. He did not stutter. He did not offer an apology for the interruption. He simply gestured to the screen, his movement precise and deliberate. The supervisor shifted in his seat, the leather chair groaning. Thomas held his breath, his finger hovering over the enter key. Thomas pressed the key. The screen flickered, then stabilized into a complex, multi-layered graph. He pointed to the bottom right corner, where a single, bold number pulsed in red. It was the exact percentage of lost revenue, calculated to the decimal point. The supervisor leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the rows of data. He reached for the mouse to scroll down, but Thomas held his hand steady on the desk, his gaze fixed on the screen. The supervisor stopped. He looked at the chart again, his jaw tightening. The red number stood out against the clean, white background. The supervisor's eyes widened, his pupils dilating as he processed the scale of the inefficiency. He tapped a finger against the desk, the sound sharp and rhythmic in the quiet office. He looked at the screen, then back at the columns, searching for an error. He found none. The data held firm. The supervisor's breath hitched, his posture shifting from dismissive to rigid as the full weight of the revelation hit him. The office clock ticked, each second sounding like a hammer against the wall. The supervisor did not speak. He stared at the monitor, his eyes darting across the rows of red numbers, searching for a calculation error or a misplaced decimal. He found nothing. The data remained static, a cold, unyielding indictment of the warehouse operations. He pulled his hand away from the mouse and let it drop onto the desk with a dull thud. He turned his head slowly, his gaze shifting from the glowing screen to Thomas. He studied Thomas's face, looking for a flicker of doubt or a sign of pride. He found neither. Thomas sat motionless, his hands folded on his lap, his expression as blank as the white walls of the office. The supervisor's breathing grew shallow. He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking under the weight of his sudden stillness. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the realization. He looked back at the screen, then at Thomas again, his jaw set tight. He did not blink. He did not reach for his pen. He simply sat, trapped in the silence. The supervisor finally broke the stillness. He shifted his weight, the chair groaning under the movement. He turned his head away from the screen and looked toward the manager, who stood by the office door. The manager remained motionless, eyes fixed on the glowing monitor. The supervisor tapped his index finger against the desk. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed against the glass partitions. He looked back at the spreadsheet, then once more at the manager, and gave a sharp, definitive nod. The manager exhaled, a sound of release that cut through the stale office air. The supervisor leaned forward, his fingers interlacing on the desk surface. He did not look at Thomas, but he spoke, his voice low and steady. He confirmed the findings and authorized the immediate implementation. Thomas felt his shoulders drop. The tension that had held his frame rigid for months began to dissipate. He watched the supervisor sign the document, the pen moving with purpose. The warehouse floor outside seemed to quiet down. Thomas stood up. The chair slid back against the floor, a sharp sound in the quiet office. He looked at his hands, steady now, no longer trembling from the exhaustion of the night shift. 730 hours. He traced the number in his mind, not as an abstract total, but as a series of physical sensations. The bite of the cold apartment air at 5 in the morning, the blue light of the laptop screen burning into his retinas, the rhythmic popping of his joints as he stood at dawn to walk the block. Every hour had been a deliberate, solitary construction. He remembered the weight of the textbook in his hands, and the way the words had blurred until they finally made sense. This promotion was not a gift handed down from above. It was the physical residue of his own persistence. He had built this outcome, one keystroke at a time, in the dark, while the rest of the world slept. The realization settled into his bones. Thomas turned away from the desk and walked toward the exit. His footsteps hit the concrete floor with a rhythmic, heavy thud that echoed through the vast, quiet warehouse. He passed the rows of inventory he had once struggled to track, his eyes scanning the shelves not with anxiety, but with the calm assessment of someone who understood the system. He reached the heavy steel door and pushed it open. The afternoon sun hit him instantly, bright and unfiltered. He stepped out onto the pavement, the warmth spreading across his skin. He stopped for a moment, letting the light fall across his face. He did not look at the ground. He did not watch his boots for uneven cracks or debris. He pulled his shoulders back, his spine straightening. until he stood at his full height. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of asphalt and distant trees. He began to walk again, his stride long and measured. He moved with a deliberate, steady pace that commanded the space around him. The weight of the past months had shifted from a burden to a foundation. He stopped at the corner where the town road met the highway. The horizon stretched out, a thin line of blue against the darkening sky. He did not feel the pull of the mattress or the exhaustion that had once defined his every waking hour. Instead, his mind clicked into place, organizing the data he would refine when the sun rose again. At 5 a.m., the alarm would vibrate, but it would no longer be a demand he feared. It would be the starting gun for a race he had already begun to win. He visualized the spreadsheet, the cells waiting for his input, the patterns he would uncover next. The cycle of the early morning remained, but the desperation had been stripped away, replaced by the cold, hard clarity. He turned his head, took one final look at the warehouse behind him, and stepped forward. He knew exactly where he was going. He was already living in the morning.